Protected Speech with Ravi Kapur and Jonathan Choe.
Alongside Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur for another edition of Protected Speech. Jonathan, on location in Austin, Texas. We want to get into what he's doing in Austin in just a moment, but first we want to briefly talk about San Francisco, which has really taken quite a bit of heat in recent weeks in light of the death of tech leader Bob Lee. And now more recently, there are more scandals involving, how San Francisco is going to approach cleaning up their streets. I mean, Jonathan has been approaching this topic in Seattle. I'm curious to see what you make of San Francisco from afar and also what you're doing in Austin.
Well, first of all, real quick, I'm in Austin right now on assignment, looking at models to house the homeless out here that are actually working. As I've railed numerous times on the housing first model, where you basically just give a set of keys to a homeless person, no questions asked, no requirements, no strings attached. Obviously, that model's not working. It's being implemented in a lot of West Coast cities. But here in Austin, what they're doing is a model focused really on community. They're recognizing here that the root causes of homelessness is, again, not the lack of housing, but actually broken relationships and families. And that's where it all starts there. So they've created a community, really, where homeless people will get housing as well, but they have the opportunity now to continue to grow, get better. And they do it with people who are literally holding their hands, walking with them on this journey. So that model is something that a lot of folks in Seattle and Washington State are now looking at. So that's why I'm here following these folks.
So, Jonathan and I have been talking about a lot of topics that are frankly not discussed in mainstream media, just because it is painful to see so many people suffering. The visuals are quite disturbing. The average person is trying to make a living, feed their families, and there's a lot of graphic stuff going on really all over the country, and it's difficult to consume. But I think it's important to stay on these topics, and we do touch on other things today, but we want to talk about this in totality. And we have a gentleman on who we greatly respect, someone who's been working as a journalist for decades. He's been in the trenches in San Francisco, and he's joining us now to discuss San Francisco as he knows it. He spent some time in other markets as well. But Stanley Roberts is someone who created his own little series in the San Francisco Bay Area called People Behaving Badly. He can get into that. But Stanley is back after a hiatus in Phoenix. And he has seen San Francisco for decades evolve from, what was a community full of immigrants to this tech hub. And it just, surged, obviously, over the course of my lifetime from, a city that was dynamic, but still a little bit off the radar to now, obviously, a world-class city. And yet now we're hit with a whole slew of problems. And Stanley's been documenting it, much like Jonathan's been documenting things in Seattle. So, hey, Stanley, it's really great to have you on joining us today. And give us your perspective on San Francisco today as you see it. I mean, you've been covering the city for decades on the ground. I mean, give us your perspective on all these different issues that, I think some folks in the Bay Area are well aware of, but, maybe nationally, they're not really sure about what's truly going on the ground.
Well, it's interesting about San Francisco and the Bay Area as a whole. I got there in 98, and you could walk the streets. I walked through streets of Oakland, walked through any part. I walked to the Bayview, which is notoriously known as a bad area for some people. I walked with a $10,000 camera over my shoulder, and no one ever said a word to me. And it was pretty much every city has its problems. I grew up in Philadelphia and in Camden, which, is the most dangerous city in the nation, 10 years in a row. So I've seen everything. So coming to San Francisco and seeing it being a vibrant city where everyone knew, I won't say everyone knew everybody, but you can get around and do things. But you knew there were some areas that you just wouldn't go to. But I watched it, I guess I could say, digress into something now that people around the world think that's what's going on in San Francisco. And I left to go to Arizona for 4 years. And when I came back, I came back to visit in 2020. So I left in 2018. I came back in 2020 to look around. And the first thing I heard from people was, why did you leave? Because when you left, everything went terrible. And I'm like, well, you can't blame me. They said, well, you're the only person that was holding people accountable. And when you left, everything just went down the tubes. And it was crazy because there was a lot going on that wasn't going on when I left. And right now, I guess you could say San Francisco is the poster child of what not to do. Although I think some of the stuff that's out there is being misrepresented.
Stanley, I've been covering the city, on and off for, frankly, now a couple decades. And as a young man, I've spent most of my formative years in the city. My parents had businesses in the city and still do, actually. I have seen this city go from having a relatively small budget to one that's now, I think, pushing around $15 billion. Now, if I'm not mistaken, that's the second largest budget in the country. Now, it's going to come down now because of COVID and federal subsidies dropping off. But second to New York City, this is a city and county of only about 800,000 people. Unbelievable resources in this city. Give me a sense of where this money has gone, because I can't even fathom, again, as someone that runs a business, and all three of us are entrepreneurial, I don't understand where all of these funds from, again, we've had incredible success in the tech sector and other, biotech and many other fields. I mean, real estate. So what has happened? Why is San Francisco really, the Skid Row area has just, enveloped many, many city blocks.
Imagine spending a little over almost $2 billion, maybe I have to look at the numbers, just on the homeless issue. And I've always said that it's almost like that whole thing, why cure cancer when you make more money treating it? So what they've done is this turned into an open market for homeless. So these nonprofits are making money hand over fist. Now here's where it gets interesting with the money hand over fist and all the money that's being spent on this, is that some, not all, of the supervisors are in line with the nonprofits. So it's a cyclical, is where they vote for something that they want, they get the money, then they put the money back into their slush fund, so to speak, to run for office again. So it's a continuous cycle of the same money over and over and over again. And there was no real accountability for where the money was going. Now, I did a segment. I came in and did a piece a couple of years ago called Gotham by the Bay. And I walked around. And I literally wrote it, shot it, and edited it. I hired an editor and did a few interviews. And it was crazy because when I came back, there were literally people passed out in their cars on fentanyl. And I'm like, what is going on here? And everybody had the same. And when you run across these nonprofit people, they all have like a tablet almost in their mind of how to, the new word was unhoused. They were no longer homeless. Now they're unhoused. I was able to go to with a hidden camera, go into what do you call them? Where they give out free needles. And when I had a person go with a hidden camera and came out with all kinds of needles and all the stuff through drugs, and they called it harm reduction. And it looked to me more like harm enabling. Now, getting back to the main point, so I'm not too far off base here, is that San Francisco, they're spending money hand over fist on things like, trash cans that cost almost $1 million. Come on, who needs $1 million trash can? There's so much money. And there's so much, and there was a corruption issue that was broke by the Marina Times a while back, and which caused a couple of people to go to jail. And it's funny because I knew the people that went to jail, and I knew them personally because I knew everybody in San Francisco government. And so all of a sudden I hear that the FBI is investigating like several people, and all those people were on my phone list. I'm like, I'm not answering my phone. You call me, I'm not talking. So it goes on. It's a constant. There's so much money being invested in ways that, like, first, there's a new one now. So to be a security guard in San Francisco, you have to have certain kind of training and you have to have certain kind of requirements. But they have a group called that literally they're out there. They're not security guards. They call them ambassadors. But they're getting $63 million to walk around the city and make sure no one ODs. And you literally have people dropping dead in the street on fentanyl poisoning. And now, this morning, they wanted to make a thing where they say, we want to call them, somebody said they want to call them drug workers and no longer drug dealers. So back to the money thing you're saying, is that there's so much money being sent into these nonprofits and all the different groups, and everybody has their hand out. But no one's getting fixed. Nothing's getting fixed.
And what we're talking about is just absolutely just infuriating. Yet that's exactly what's happening here in Seattle as well. It's also happening in Portland, and I just can't help but notice that these all happen to be, cities run by Democratic leaders, and they all happen to have councils or city managers that tend to lean far left or progressive or even activist in some cases. And you brought up a really important point. This whole harm reduction lobby. Can you believe, and we're all in the media, we've all worked in corporate, local, mainstream media, that there's not even a pushback to that narrative? Let that sink in. Stanley, I don't know if you have an answer to this, but you've observed it as well, and you brought it up. The harm reduction lobby, as you said, is just like cancer. It's too big to fail. It's like this homeless industrial complex.
It is. It's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and you have so many tentacles and hundreds of $1 million at stake that if these problems get cured, you lose jobs. You lose six-figure, $300,000 salaries for these CEOs of these nonprofits. So, where is the other side on this, Stanley? Right?
Well,
And yeah, go ahead.
as long as people are making money off of this thing, they will never go away. This is like, you ever put a piece of sugar down on the ground and watch the ants show up and eat that sugar, and they'll keep eating that sugar until they run out? Well, this is the same kind of thing. We're dropping that money on the ground, and they're all rushing into it, and they don't leave, and we're just feeding more money into it, and more people are showing up to eat this, quote unquote sugar, and it goes on. And you're right. A lot of them don't live in San Francisco. They go home to their, everybody has $1 million home, so I guess I can't say $1 million homes because everybody seems to have one out here. But they go, they have a new BMW every 3 years. And I talk to people who don't want to go on camera, but they work for nonprofits, and they watch these people. Every year they have something new. And I looked at some of the fact sheets where it looks like that most of the money is being paid in salaries. And in case one of them I looked at, which was their 50, nonprofit, literally they had used maybe 700,000 to help people, but the rest of the 14 million was for salaries and for vehicles and what have you. So it's funny thing is absolute power is corrupt. If once you have that much money, people just lose their minds, and it's always been that way, always will be that way. And I'm on the outside looking in. When I went to Arizona, I could watch this going on, and I had a little thing I did called "What the hell is going on in San Francisco?" because it was so. It's just in your face too. It's not even hidden. It's like, look at me. Look how much I'm. Like I was talking about urban alchemy. That's the name that left me. Now these guys are like not really security guards. They're basically they gave them the name ambassadors, but they're doing security guard jobs. And there's been a lot of complaints about the work they've been doing.
Where is our local press in San Francisco? Because we're barely there. Look, I'm an outsider looking in, but corporate, local, mainstream media. Ravi and I talk about this all the time. This isn't brand safe content. In other words, you're not going to be selling diaper ads next to a guy smoking fentanyl, right? Yet this is the type of stuff that needs to be covered. It's an issue. It's a top 3 issue in the Bay Area. Stanley, you're covering the raw realities on the ground. I am as well. We're talking about it right now. It's happening real time. Yet local media, why are they failing to cover this story?
So, this, being a journalist, that news now is consultant driven. And if you notice, the new trend on local news is good news. Everything like we're building a better Bay Area, things like that. When I started doing people behaving badly, and it wasn't, the segment itself wasn't about bad behavior. It was educational videos to show you that if you do this, this is what the consequences are. And I would even cite law. I literally had the driver code book this thick to go through it to figure out if I can tell them how they can avoid a ticket and how much it's going to cost. I'm working on one right now. I did with Step where I did a ride along, and I'm working on red light people running stop signs or what have you. So going back to it is that I would go in and do these stories and create, to teach people how to do things better. But now the way the journalism works now is that they're just more about, some of them are trying to get back into it, but a lot of these like online magazines, they're either far left or far right, and you can know that because some of them are getting their money from. If you do your research, you see where the money's coming from, and you know that the groups that are paying for this, they have their own interests in mind. Nobody
No,
else.
it's a great point, Stanley, because we've all worked in corporate media, and certainly there were certain corporations that would get some favorable treatment. Certainly at one of the stations that I worked at, where it was kind of catering to this elite, educated audience, and they would have Silicon Valley related stories of the preeminent. You can name the top 3 to 5 companies, and they would get highlighted almost daily in generally a favorable light. And you can see that with sports coverage. You can see that with all kinds of preeminent entities, and that is, for better or worse, that is how corporate media works. I mean, that someone has to pay those salaries, someone has to pay the bills, and it's kind of a trade-off. It's a back and forth. I scratch your back, and you scratch mine, so to speak. And that's, I think, one of the challenges we have is that these companies have gotten massive. We don't have that much local ownership. And when you don't have people invest in the community, you have people centralizing the profit into some headquarters somewhere else that's usually in a state where there's no corporate tax as well, and people aren't invested in the community, then these are the downstream effects, right? And then they put it on a guy like Stanley or Jonathan or myself to some degree, and they say, well, can you go cover the community? How much can you possibly do? I know Jonathan was out there covering all kinds of stuff in Seattle. He was the only guy really covering things in the trenches because it had gotten so bad. Most of the other reporters didn't have the institutional knowledge. I mean, Stanley, because you worked at Cron for such a long time and you were an institution, did you get pushback from management about some of the stories you did? And did you get pushback from, obviously, I would imagine you get pushback from some of the public officials you were covering?
Well, I think a lot of public officials were scared of me because they knew that if I called them, then I literally had a joke one day where I called a public official just to see how they were doing. And I said, hey, I got a video I want to show you. Can I come by your office? And there was a long pause because they're like, oh, no, what's going on? And I'm like, I'm just kidding. I don't have anything. I just want to see how you're doing. But I was literally scared of the politicians when they knew that. And I knew them all on a first name basis, and they knew me. Funny story, though, when you mentioned that, is that I remember one day I got a phone call from someone who worked for the city of San Francisco. And they told me, they said, hey, I just had this come across my desk, that it was a inter-office memorandum that said, we got to get this fixed before Stanley Roberts finds out about it. If he finds out, it'll be on TV and we'll be in trouble. So this, and I couldn't believe it. And it's really interesting because a lot of tips I get are from city employees who tell me what's going on, but they want to be left out of it. And so it got so bad that some people would literally, if they thought that they were friends with me or knew me, that they were under scrutiny by the city to make, because they thought that they were quote unquote snitching to me on some stories. So I had to be careful about who I even talked to in public, because even just seeing me in public created a problem. Now, here's something I found out after I left. And this wasn't on London Breed's watch. This was a different mayor. But apparently they had a team that was supposed to monitor everything I do when I'm out. So they would follow me from when I left the station to see what I was doing. And if it was San Francisco, and I figured something was wrong because one day I was doing a story on the corner, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, all these city workers started showing up and fixing stuff up. And I'm like, this is odd. Why is this going on? And it turns out that they were literally watching me to make sure that I didn't get anything on the air. And they didn't know what the story was. They just knew that I was there. So they'll just clean up everything to make sure that it didn't make it on TV.
This sounds exactly what Jonathan's going through in Washington State. I wonder if Governor Jay Inslee has something to say about your coverage, Jonathan.
I mean, look, Stanley's been following my work from a distance as well. Stanley, you alluded to a local official. There have been several actually here in Seattle and Washington State. Our governor tried to get me kicked out of a press conference because he didn't want to answer tough questions. And another King County executive basically accused me of promoting the Proud Boys, a far-right group, as you know. because I confronted him about a homeless megaplex shelter that he was trying to ram through on the outskirts of Chinatown without consulting the seniors. You know what I'm talking about. This happens all the time where you have these elected officials who just quietly try to, bring things in to fulfill their agenda. And like you, Stanley, yeah, I can relate. I would just continue to encourage you and I commend you because what that says is we're doing our jobs as journalists to hold these people accountable. And, that's what we're losing. Ravi and I, we're like, are we still the fourth estate, right? Are we the watchdogs?
We are.
Are we doing consultant driven news? The consultants don't care. Now these days, I worked at Como TV, the ABC affiliate, less than a year ago, and I'm coming up on my 1 year anniversary since I got fired again for allegedly promoting the Proud Boys. But anyway, when I was in those morning news meetings, and Stanley, you could probably relate. This is a Sinclair-owned company. Our managers would have these Magid consultants. Magid is a consulting group that a lot of local TV stations use, and we have these veteran reporters in the news meeting, and you have these 20 somethings at Magid who could not hold, veteran reporter Matt Markovich's jockstrap, and they're telling us how to do the news. Oh, it's got to be in this bucket. We got to focus just on COVID. Oh, it's got to be. I'm like, come on. And that's the state of local TV news. And it's sad because all three of us, we're in the business now because we love TV. We love video, the power of video. But at the same time, I'm still encouraged because of all these new platforms now that it's really been democratized. We have the opportunity as independent journalists to really, amplify these stories, and there's an appetite for it.
It reminds me of two things. First of all, one day I ran into Governor Newsom at an event, and I said, "Hey, you don't write, you don't call." I said, he was a lieutenant governor. We talked, but when he became governor, he stopped talking to me. And I said, "You don't write, you don't call." He goes, "Oh man, I'm sorry, Stanley, my fault. I've been really busy." So then I go back to work, and then I get a letter from the governor's office. Now it was a form letter that was, hey, thank you for being, the governor. But he crossed out all the written, the computer stuff and wrote it by hand. Said, "Hey, Stanley, sorry for not keeping in touch." I still have that letter. It's pretty
Wow.
funny. It was handwritten by him. But back to the stories about the news. So I didn't sit in on the meetings early a lot of times because my stories were in my head and I knew when to go out and do it. But they hired consultants and they wanted everybody, all the reporters, to sit down with a consultant to talk about how you can become a better journalist. And so I went into the room to sit down with a consultant, and they looked at me and go, "How can I tell you how to be better when you created your own franchise? I can't tell you how to make your franchise better. You've already done it. It's right there. And I had reporters from other TV stations because my station did not want me to know that I was doing really good. So the other stations would bring me data from, the trend board for Twitter and social media, and shows that for
Yep.
weeks and weeks at a time, I was number one. And even when I wasn't in San Francisco, I was still number one in San Francisco on social media, which was crazy. I was number one in San Francisco and Arizona at the same time. So that was the kind of input that I had. And even to this day, I left for 4 years. And typically, if you leave for 4 years, no one knows who you are. You're just some guy that just shows up. But I can't go anywhere without somebody going, "Hey, Stanley Roberts." And they act like I've still been here, like I never left. But only because I found out that my old station ran all of my footage for 4 years like I was still there at the station. They literally had my website still up. When you leave a station, they don't leave your website, your stuff up. They take it down. I was up for 4 years. They even made a YouTube channel. They made what's that other one? Roku channel, a TikTok channel with my videos. All that stuff they did to play it off like I'm still there. And if you go on their YouTube channel right now and you look for the top few videos, guess who comes up? I don't know. Maybe it's me, but that's what I've been noticing. And so I'm doing my own stuff now with Mr. Badley Productions. You can go there at MrBadley.com and see the stuff that I'm trying to do and trying to create. But I want to get out back in the trenches. But it's a little bit more difficult than it was before because in the Bay Area, I don't know about in Seattle, they're robbing crews at gunpoint.
Yeah, it
And
hasn't got that bad. But real quick, getting back to your point, I think all three of us, and Kapoor, chime in at any time, we know how important now more than ever intellectual property is. You owning the video, you having original content, because content is king. We talk about that all the time, and you could put this now on more than a dozen platforms and monetize it. And you're your own brand, Stanley. And what's amazing, it's still growing. But getting back to Seattle versus San Francisco, and I was going to call it San Fran, but San Francisco. The we haven't gotten to the point where crews are getting robbed, but I don't know. I'm one of the few reporters who've been attacked now numerous times. Not necessarily by criminals. I did get attacked by a homeless guy who came out with me with a baseball bat recently, and a fentanyl addicted teen who chased me with a hatchet. But I'm dealing with the far left activist class, Antifa. Stanley, I'm just wondering, are you being targeted as well by the far left?
I'm glad you asked that question, because just last week, I did an interview with a guy named JJ Smith, and they targeted him, saying that he wasn't he was hiding his face, that he was just showing stuff against people against their will. So I chimed in and said, "Look, they're trolls, leave them alone." Well, they decided to come back after me again. This time, though, it got to the point where one person created fake text messages and posted them saying that I was threatening to come there and beat their behinds, and that I also hired a woman and who was using a quote unquote burner phone to target them, which was all made up. I was doxxed the other day when my phone number was put out on Twitter. Some of my fans wrote Twitter and had it taken down. But I learned that this whole social media thing has gotten out of hand, and I've been targeted over and over again. Even the other day, I just wrote about I was walking down the Embarcadero and it was clean on the port side, and I woke up to 111,000 views of my picture with the bridge behind me, telling me that I don't know what I'm talking about. It's not safe. I never said it wasn't safe. I never said anything like that. All I said was it was a beautiful day on Easter to walk down the Embarcadero, and they just went ape crazy over that one. So I have been getting attacked over and over again to the point where now I've taken it from social media to when there are threats like the people posting fake text messages, I turn it over to law enforcement and let them do the forensic background to check it out, because my reputation is all I have, and if you lose that, and what they attempt to do, and they try to do to you too, is they try to tear you down by making false accusations that you have to prove is not true. And sometimes the accusations you can't prove, because like being called a Proud Boy supporter, how do you prove you're not? You make up stuff now, and we're in a world where people just make up whatever they want on social media, and perception is the new reality. And unfortunately, what people perceive is what they believe nowadays.
It's a great point, Stanley. I mean, I've kind of gone from covering primarily a general market like you both continue to do to focused on a niche, focused on, Indian Americans and South Asians primarily, because this was, to me, as someone of that background, it was just completely ignored, and starting to serve micro niches, Filipinos or Vietnamese and other groups, and even in places like North Dakota, which they were getting programming from LA and New York. And that is not the lifestyle they have in North Dakota. And so we created local programming for that region as well. And what's been fascinating is that now, obviously, a lot of these characters that we've been covering over the years are now starting to get prominence in mainstream. I mean, one of them I'm sure you've interacted with is Vice President Kamala Harris, who we saw in San Francisco 2 decades ago. And when I'm sure the first time you met her, you thought, okay, this lady's going places. And I certainly thought she had her eyes on the White House. And there she is, right there on the precipice. And then, of course, we have other folks, even one guy in the South Bay, Ro Khanna, who very likely is going to be running for president in 2028, though he won't publicly say that, and other people that we interface with. So I think this is what's interesting, is that, when you cover controversial topics and I think Twitter, since all three of us use Twitter in various degrees, I just held a Twitter Spaces event covering a very controversial issue called caste. And when you talk about that, you're going to have people who say, hey, you're a bigot for supporting XYZ, and you're a racist if you're supporting something else, and you're left wing or you're right wing, and it's just like, yeah, people are trying to diminish and tarnish you, and really often use straw man arguments, which is which is wild, But here the three of us are independent journalists, still standing, despite all the rhetoric and the vitriol that you do get arrows in the back. I mean, the reality is I've seen Jonathan take all kinds of shots, especially over the last year plus, and he's still standing stronger than ever. Stanley, you're back in San Francisco. I think in many respects, we've covered a lot of these negative stories, but I think the hopeful part is there are people pushing back on kind of the common narratives, because the reality is that, look, we are outgunned when it comes to PR versus actual journalists. And I was having a conversation with a guy today, and I was like, there is a difference between a news reader with respect to the people that read the news and people who are actually doing enterprise journalism. There is a difference. And those are far and few between, people with that kind of skill set. And I think this is where, we're covering different niches, different segments, but the results are the same. You're uncovering the muck that needs to be uncovered.
I try to do I do fact-based journalism. If I can't prove it, I don't say it, because if your reputation, your integrity is all you have, and it can be torn down in just a snap of a finger snap. And people are looking for you to mess up so they can say, look what he did, look what I said, look what happened. So I try to keep everything I do fact-based. Now, if you look at my Twitter, which is my name, Stanley Roberts, you look in there and you'll see, I just did a poll the other day and I asked people, hey, what do you think my political affiliation is? Because I wanted to know what people think. Because it's funny, because I have people on both sides of the aisle. I have Republicans. It's Trump supporters, anti-Biden, pro-Biden, but I never really reveal what my political affiliation is, because if I do that, then that makes me biased. And that's never where I want to come across. So when I asked that, most people didn't know, although some people think they know, but they don't. And I never will reveal it because it's none of their business. But I was curious because, I read, and I don't respond to political rhetoric when someone writes something like the Democrats or the Republicans. But that's what they do. They write that on a regular basis, and I see it, but I just don't get involved in it, because the minute you get involved, you've lost your objectivity, and now you're picking sides. And I try not to pick sides. I try to look at the whole thing. But my focus has always been on bad behavior. I don't really do a lot of politics. I focus on what are the results of what this is going on and what's causing this. And just like when I did Gotham by the Bay, it was, look at what's going on. Look how they're treating people. Look how things are going on. I went out with the police. I walked with them as they were trying to arrest people. I watched people as they were walking by with machetes down the middle of the street. Drug sales. I used hidden camera to watch hand-to-hand drug sales. And the thing I noticed was that this quote-unquote war on drugs, they were literally selling fentanyl and crack cocaine 100 feet away from the federal building where the DEA and where they're located. And I'm like, how is this even allowed to happen? And then all of a sudden, the Fed police started showing up and clearing the area out. But why does it take that to get things to happen? We have to get out there and show what's going on. If we don't show what's going on, people don't know. And so I like to show it, but I like to be out there in the trenches and show it. And it's weird because when I walk up to someone and they'll say, where's your camera? Because you must have a camera. I'm like, I'm at a funeral. Why would I have a camera here? So it's just, I've gotten that reputation where people know me, and when I show up, they think that they're automatically on camera, that I have a camera somewhere and they're about to be on TV. And a quickly funny note was one day I saw a city worker, parking enforcement, on her phone driving one of those little buggies. And I looked at her and I said, hey, you shouldn't be on your phone. And she told me to go, do something I couldn't do. And if I could, I'd never leave the house. And she goes, oh, wait, you're Stanley Roberts. And she goes, oh, am I going to be on your show? And I said, you know what? I guess we wanted that all day now, won't you? There you go.
Let me ask you both a question here. Jonathan has seen the underbelly of Seattle now. Stanley, you've been in San Francisco for a long time. I'm actually spending a lot of time, not as much in San Francisco as I once did, but I spent a lot of time in San Jose. And San Jose just put in a new mayor who basically ran on a kind of a homeless program. In fact, I don't want to call it eradication, but he wants to have a tougher stance on homelessness. And he's in the trenches. He's only been in office for a couple of months, but he's already been putting out videos talking to homeless folks, trying to get them rehabbed and back into jobs. I mean, he's very proactive about it. He thinks public safety is at the paramount of what he has to do as mayor, and he handily defeated someone who had been in the San Jose ecosystem for more than 2 decades and had endorsements from the whole Democratic Party, but he won as an outsider. I'm curious about what you both are seeing, and I'll start with you, Jonathan, in Seattle. What is it going to take to fix Seattle? And then Stanley, same question for San Francisco.
I mean, how about starting with enforcing the laws that are already on the books? I mean, you need to have courageous leaders who are willing to, at the very least, do that. The city of Seattle has really become lawless in the past, few years. And again, this goes back to the activist city council. You have some who are just empty suits, and others who are just radical extremists. But the council, there are 4 seats now that are up for grabs, so there's some hope there. We have a moderate mayor in Bruce Harrell who's entering his, who's in his second year now, and slowly things are turning around because, again, he's ordered the Seattle Police Department to start enforcing the laws. But what I'm also seeing, again, is these laws that are not being enforced, bad laws are being made at the state level. So really the state legislature, especially in a state like Washington that is blue, I think the way, things only get done goes back to public shaming. And there are a lot of groups now on the ground. This goes back to the media, Stanley. I always like to say the video don't lie. And again, news articles don't go viral as much as videos. And there's a reason for that. And I know, Stanley, every lawmaker in California knows who you are, and at the very least will get wind of your videos and your coverage. So that's what really puts the fear in a lot of these politicians. Bad press, any controversy. So what I always do as well now, I'm trying to cover my community objectively, but when people ask me, what can I do? Aside from voting, take out your iPhone and start recording and showing what's happening on the ground, the raw realities, because you also have access to YouTube, Twitter, TikTok. And at the end of the day, videos go viral, and send it to me. I'll get it out there. I'll report on it, and let's start these conversations, because that's the only way. And this is the other problem with Seattle. I don't know if San Francisco is like this, but we have a reputation of being passive aggressive. But the community's starting to wake up now, because these folks who are just like, look, I just want to make my money, I want to raise my family, and they have every right to, and they should. But it's now starting to impact them when they get broken into, smash and grabs, when their property is being vandalized, when you have fentanyl addicts just throwing foil all over the place in front of their stores and doorways. They're like, enough is enough, right?
So to answer your question, a lot of what he said, I can almost parrot it, except for San Francisco is going to take 5 to 10 more years to fix. Why do I say 5 to 10 more years? That's a pretty big number. How would you come up with those numbers? Well, they're short somewhere around 500 to 600 officers. And to even get new officers in there, it's going to take a lot of years of getting them on the ground, the boots on the ground, and getting them out there, which is going to take a little bit. The problem is no one, like the last class had 12 officers. Now, to give you an example, the same exact time, it was Long Beach graduated 46 or 48 officers at the same exact time. The 2 classes graduated at the same time, 12 versus 46, because the politics in San Francisco are anti-law enforcement. So even the police commission right now has been drafting things to make sure that they don't do, that the police can't do their job. They're being handicapped. The police can't do anything almost. I mean, they can try to, they say there's an 85% crime solving rate, but there's not enough officers to cover it. So, we have priority calls, A, B, and C, and the A's are like somebody's like life or death. Those are the ones they're really responding to right now. The rest of them, if they can get to it, they'll try to get to it, but they're dealing with the high priority calls right now. But at the same time, everybody has their camera out trying to record the cops. But if you try to record, if like somebody like me with a camera, all of a sudden, oh, you can't take my picture. You don't have my permission, but yet you can record everything out there that's going on. Now, there are some people on the ground, some boots on the ground right now that are trying, even when I say boots, these are citizen journalists who some people say they've got the idea from me, where they go out with their phones and they record stuff and they post it on Twitter. But they're being shouted down again by some of these different groups. So San Francisco has a rep for, number one, people think that if you go there, there's poop everywhere. That's not necessarily true. There are some areas of San Francisco that are great, that nothing happens. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. But if you believe the 9% of the people on Twitter who are yelling about how terrible it is, that's what you see. That people say, "Oh, it's terrible." And I say the number again. It's like 9% of the people on Twitter are the ones that yell the loudest about how terrible San Francisco is. And of the 9%, some of them don't even live in the Bay Area. They just come on, and you can tell the ones that are coming in, what they do is they use the same speech over and over again. And it's almost like you can almost take the tweets and match them up word for word. And for example, for a fact that they're using this as they're putting it out there so that everybody can do the same thing over and over again. A good example is when the San Francisco Police Commission decided to cut back on, they called it traffic stops. Some certain have been quote unquote banned. And I read the list of the number of the people that were for and against it. Now the list for was like this big and the list against was like this big. But when I read each one of them, it was the exact same wording. It was like a form paper that they put out and then you just signed your name on it. But so these people are working the hardest because they work really hard because they want to keep and we go back to the beginning of our conversation, they're making money off of this. So why would you want to kill your money when you can keep doing it and keep making more money? And as long as there's money to be made pushing things the wrong agenda, it's going to continue to be that way. So now we have lack of police, we have misinformation, we have things that are out there that shouldn't be out there. We have needles being given out. Now, don't get me wrong. San Francisco has always had a problem with needles. I did a story once where I went out and walked around for 4 hours in San Francisco and found 300 needles all around the city. So, and now imagine that was then. Now it's just so many needles and people in different areas where people are passed out and people are dying from fentanyl. And, there was even a firefighter, not a firefighter, but a person who worked with the paramedics to help people with fentanyl. She died of fentanyl. And J.J. Smith, that's his Twitter account. It's something at war or something. He documented this. And I did a story on the show with the stuff he documented. San Francisco went from this great utopia to what the hell is going on? But people are starting to see the light, and there's a tide change. But unfortunately, it's going to take a while because this mess has been made, and it's like a pot of grits that just sat there and just got thick, and you have to scrape out the bad parts so you can use it. They even use the pot again, and so San Francisco is a pot of grits that just sat too long. And you can't clean it out because it takes a lot to do it.
Well, I'll tell you what, Stanley, we've tried to get a few people, prominent people from San Francisco to come on and join us, folks that are prolific on Twitter. But frankly, as we've both of you have expressed, they have received threats to their life. And they do not want to speak publicly about what's really going on. And so the political process is something that is entrenched, and we're going to see if some of these movements will change what's going on, because it's certainly changed. I interned at San Francisco City Hall 20 plus years ago, and things have radically changed since you have what used to be part-time jobs. The Board of Soups used to be part-time workers. They actually had real full-time jobs. A few years later, they were able to ratify a full-time salary with benefits, and now all these folks have fiefdoms. They're each district. They're like kings or queens.
And they give themselves raises. And they give themselves raises. I wish I could give myself a raise.
So we're going to keep on this. Stanley, I want to get a couple more stories in because we are running short on time. But there's a couple of interesting topics, and I'm going to wrap up this show with our traditional segment on AAPI hate. But before we do that, just one big story out of Chicago that I've been following that has basically come to its conclusion. The startup company called Outcome Health. The two founders were Indian American founders, Rishi Shah and Shraddha Agrawal. Those two people were convicted of running a $1 billion corporate fraud scheme. They'd raised really hundreds of millions of dollars. They had like benefactors like Goldman Sachs, like giving them $500 million credit lines, something astronomical. And they were kind of in the pseudo media space. So I took interest, obviously, since I run a media company myself. And I actually met, what was interesting to me at least, is I met Rishi Shah at one of my family members' weddings. And I ended up having dinner with this guy. And I was like, wow, this guy had done incredibly well in a short amount of time. Well, it turns out the whole thing was a hoax. And so he and his co-founder, Shraddha Agarwal, who were like the darlings of Chicago tech, both were found guilty, and as well as a third executive for Outcome Health. So interesting story, at least from my standpoint, as this has been culminated. Basically, if you try to build Goldman Sachs, good luck. They will go after you. And finally, with Stanley here, I want to put in this segment here for our regular Stop AAPI Hate presented by the California State Library. Stanley obviously has seen hate crimes increase in San Francisco. And today we're covering a story out of San Jose where there were a couple of suspects arrested, apprehended for ostensibly targeting Asian Americans in San Jose. I don't know, Jonathan, if you want to chime in quickly before we get Stanley's thoughts. What do you make of this?
Well, this is a common occurrence now, and unfortunately for the Asian American community, especially women and older women, there's word on the street, especially among the criminals, that Asian Americans tend to carry cash. Yes. So they're going to be targeted. They carry lots of cash in their purses. And, this just keeps on happening, unfortunately. So I'm glad these fellas got caught. But, I always look at the race, Stanley, and this is what I want to get your thoughts on. But it's rarely, at least in San Francisco, at least when it comes to these viral videos, do you see the perpetrators being white. It's usually black or brown, like in this case. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that as well, because that's kind of a topic of debate. And
if you can keep it short too, Stanley, because we are running out of time here.
I'll be as short as possible. I wrote a tweet a long time ago about how they were blaming, they were saying black people are robbing, the Asian community. And I'm black. I'm not robbing them. So they can't paint a broad brush to say that blacks are robbing anyone. Yes, that's a video you see, but I've also seen videos of other people too as well. But the one that gets the most prominent are the black and brown during the robberies are the ones that because it perpetrates a stereotype that's already out there.
Well, we actually had a black guy, Indian guy, and Korean guy on mainstream television for this, maybe the first time ever in American television history. So they wouldn't let us on corporate media, so we had to do our own thing.
Wait a minute, say it again.
So,
I was just going to say, real talk. When's the last time, Stanley, we saw the three of us who look like us on the same screen?
Oh, yeah, it's rare, but I'm glad we can do this. This is great.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever happened before, but we got to do it again. Hey, Stanley Roberts, a real great pleasure to see you. I'm very glad you're back in my hometown, and we got to clean it up. I mean, we're not going to give up on San Francisco. We got to keep at it. Jonathan fighting the good fight in Austin. For Stanley Roberts and Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur. We'll see you next time here on Protected Speech.